We often think of movie stars as symbols of loyalty and romance. But for these 12 icons, love was just another script to be rewritten. Behind the awards and the standing ovations lies a history of calculated betrayal that would make a villain blush. From abandoning their own flesh and blood to systematically destroying the mentors who discovered them. These celebrities operated with a coldness that few in the audience ever suspected. This is not just about messy divorces. It is about the deliberate, strategic abandonment of everyone who ever stood by them. Today, we open the files on the stars who had ice in their veins. At number 1 is Bette Davis. Bette Davis was the queen of the psychological thriller, but her most terrifying performance happened within the walls of her own home. While she projected the image of a fiercely independent woman to the world, she treated her daughter Bette Mayan as a psychological pawn. Davis demanded absolute cult-like loyalty, but offered only emotional manipulation and explosive rage in return, creating an environment where her child felt more like a servant than a daughter. The betrayal became a matter of public record when Bette published a memoir exposing the decades of domestic toxicity. Rather than seeking reconciliation or acknowledging the pain she had caused, Davis's response was a masterpiece of cold-blooded retaliation. She used her massive platform to publicly humiliate her daughter, portraying herself as the victim and turning her industry friends against her own flesh and blood. The final act of betrayal was written into Davis's will. She chose to permanently sever the bond by cutting her daughter and her grandsons out of her multi-million-dollar inheritance entirely. Davis took her resentment to the grave, proving that her pride was more valuable to her than her family. She left the world as a legend of the screen, but to those who shared her DNA, she was a woman who chose a legacy of spite over a legacy of love. And number 2 is Joan Crawford. The legendary rivalry between Crawford and Bette Davis was nothing compared to the private war she waged against her own adopted children. Crawford used her family as a sophisticated PR tool, posing for perfect mother photo shoots for fan magazines, while privately subjecting her children to bizarre and cruel disciplinary rituals. She betrayed the fundamental trust of the mother-child bond, viewing her kids as disposable props that existed only to enhance her public image as a saintly matron. Behind the locked doors of her mansion, Crawford's obsession with cleanliness and control turned into a nightmare for her children. She would frequently destroy their favorite toys or clothes to assert dominance, proving that her own psychological neuroses were more important than their emotional well-being. She lived a double life where her screen presence radiated strength, while her domestic reality was defined by a calculated lack of empathy for the very children she claimed to have saved. When Crawford passed away, she delivered a final calculated blow from beyond the grave. She explicitly excluded her 2 eldest children from her will, stating she had reasons they were well aware of. This final act of financial and emotional abandonment confirmed what her children had long suspected, that Joan Crawford was incapable of a loyalty that did not serve her own career. She died a star, but her children inherited nothing but the trauma of her cold-blooded deception. At number 3 is Peter Owl. Peter Owl possessed a magnetic charm that could enchant an entire theater, but that same charm was often used as a weapon against those closest to him. At the height of his global fame following Lawrence of Arabia, Odell essentially checked out of his domestic life, treating his responsibilities as a husband and father as trivial inconveniences. He betrayed the foundation of his marriage to actress Shawn Phillips by disappearing for weeks at a time on alcohol-fueled benders, leaving her to clean up the wreckage of his public and private scandals. The betrayal was not just in his absence, but in his total disregard for the emotional labor required to maintain a family. He engaged in hundreds of fleeting affairs with a clinical detachment, never considering the humiliation his wife faced as these stories leaked into the press. He lived a life of absolute self-indulgence, operating under the belief that his artistic genius excused him from the basic moral requirements of a partner. By the time the marriage finally collapsed, Odell had left a trail of emotional devastation. He had spent years gaslighting those who loved him, making them feel responsible for his own destructive choices. He remained a titan of the British stage, but his private history was a series of abandoned loyalties. For Odell, the world was a stage where he was the only actor who mattered, and his family was merely the audience he eventually forgot to acknowledge. At number 4 is Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was arguably the most beloved comedian in British history, yet he possessed a pathological habit of destroying the very people who built his success. He systematically turned on his writers Galton and Simpson, the creative minds who had crafted the Hancock persona that the nation adored. In an act of extreme professional betrayal, he convinced himself that their genius was holding him back, firing them at the peak of their success in a desperate, cold-blooded bid for total autonomy. This pattern of betrayal extended to his fellow performers, whom he viewed with increasing suspicion and jealousy. He would cut out their best lines and distance himself from anyone he felt was stealing his spotlight. He betrayed the mentors and colleagues who had stood by him during his darkest hours, choosing to isolate himself rather than share the glory. He lived in a state of clinical paranoia, believing that his loyalty belonged only to his own evolving and increasingly unstable vision of himself. The tragedy of Hancock's betrayal was that it ultimately led to his own undoing. By cutting off the writers and friends who acted as his creative lifeline, his career began a rapid and irreversible decline. He died alone in Australia, having successfully pushed away every person who truly understood his talent. He proved that when you betray those who make you a star, you are eventually left with nothing but the silence of an empty room and the weight of your own ego. At number 5 is Sid James. Sid James was a mainstay of British comedy, but his climb to the top of the Carry On franchise was marked by a cold-blooded betrayal of his closest professional partner, Tony Hancock. While the two were viewed as an inseparable comedic duo, Sid began making clandestine side deals the moment he sensed Hancock's mental stability was wavering. Instead of offering support to the man who had helped secure his fame, Sid effectively stepped over him to secure a solo future in the industry. The betrayal was a slow and calculated process. Sid James allowed Hancock to believe they were still a team while he was actively building a separate brand that did not include his struggling friend. When the split finally came, it shattered Hancock, but Sid moved on with a clinical lack of remorse. He understood the brutal mechanics of show business and decided that his personal career survival was worth more than a decade of shared loyalty and friendship. For the rest of his career, Sid James enjoyed the fruits of his solo stardom, rarely acknowledging the man he had left behind. He maintained a lovable rogue image for the public, but those in the industry knew him as a man who would prioritize a contract over a comrade. His success was built on the ruins of a legendary partnership, proving that in the world of entertainment, the most infectious laughter often masks a very cold heart. At number 6 is Vanessa Redgrave. Vanessa Redgrave is an undeniable acting titan, but her career has been defined by a series of political betrayals that often left her colleagues in professional jeopardy. She frequently used high-profile film sets, where hundreds of people's livelihoods were at stake, as platforms for her own radical agendas. By doing so, she betrayed the collective trust of the cast and crew, often forcing them to be associated with her controversial views without their consent, leading to boycotts and lost revenue. The coldness of her betrayal lay in her refusal to consider the little people of the industry. While she had the wealth and status to survive a scandal, the technicians and minor actors she worked with did not. She betrayed the unwritten social contract of the theater, which dictates that the production comes first. For Redgrave, her personal ideology was always the priority, even if it meant her co-stars were collateral damage in her private war with the establishment. Her actions often led to intense friction on set, where her cold-blooded focus on her own beliefs made her a pariah among those who valued professional stability. She proved that, even in the arts, loyalty can be discarded in favor of a higher cause. But in doing so, she lost the trust of the very community she sought to lead. She remains a legend, but one whose legacy is stained by the hundreds of professional bridges she burned in the pursuit of her own uncompromising vision. At number 7 is Michael Redgrave. Michael Redgrave, the patriarch of one of Britain's most famous acting dynasties, lived a life that was essentially a half-century of deception. To the public and his children, he was the stable anchor of a high-prestige family. Yet he was leading a massive double life, full of clandestine affairs and hidden identities. He betrayed the fundamental reality of his home, allowing his wife and children to live in a house of cards that was only revealed decades later. The betrayal was clinical in its execution. He maintained the perfect marriage while privately engaging in a lifestyle that stood in total opposition to the values he projected. This forced his family to exist in a state of perpetual unspoken tension. Sensing a truth that Michael was too cold to ever fully admit, he chose the safety of his public image over the honesty required for a real relationship, leaving his children to piece together his true identity long after the damage was done. When the truth finally surfaced, it reframed the entire Redgrave legacy as one built on a foundation of omission. Michael had been a master of the hidden truth, proving that a man can be a national hero while being a stranger to his own wife. He died with his reputation intact, but the betrayal of his family's shared reality remains a dark chapter in the history of the British stage, a reminder that the most convincing performances often happen at the dinner table. At number 8 is Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell, famous as the dirty old man of British sitcoms, was a man who practiced betrayal as a form of final revenge. Throughout his decades of fame, he kept his family and closest associates at an emotional distance, ensuring that no one ever truly gained access to his private thoughts or his growing fortune. He lived a life of deliberate isolation, allowing those around him to believe they were part of his inner circle while he secretly planned a cold-blooded exit. The ultimate betrayal occurred upon his death in 1985. Brambles will reveal that he had bypassed his family and his longtime loyalists entirely, leaving his entire estate to a complete stranger he had met only months prior. This act was seen as a clinical middle finger to everyone who had supported him during his career. It was a calculated move designed to shock and hurt those who expected a final gesture of gratitude or love. His family was left with nothing but questions and the public humiliation of being discarded by the man they had stood by. Bramble proved that you could spend a lifetime with someone and still not know the depth of their capacity for betrayal. He died having the last laugh, a cold-blooded comedian who used his final act to prove that, for him, loyalty was nothing more than a punchline he chose to ignore. At number 9 is Charles Chaplin. Charles Chaplin may have built his empire on the image of fighting for the underdog, but his professional life was defined by a cold-blooded betrayal of his workers. He was notorious for discovering young actresses, using them to build his masterpieces, and then firing them the moment they sought higher wages or aged out of his personal preference. He betrayed the very people who gave his films their heart, treating them as disposable parts of his cinematic machine. This pattern extended to his long-term staff, many of whom had been with him since the silent era. Chaplin was famously stingy with salaries, often betraying the loyalty of those who had worked long hours to make him a multi-millionaire. He operated with a clinical lack of empathy, viewing his employees not as partners in his success, but as tools to be discarded once their utility had expired. He was a man who preached about the common man while systematically exploiting him. The ultimate betrayal was Chaplin's refusal to share the credit for the creative genius of his films. He often minimized the contributions of his directors and co-stars, ensuring that the Chaplin brand remained untainted by the influence of others. He died a global icon, but his history is a trail of abandoned collaborators and underpaid loyalists. He proved that you can win the world's heart while being entirely cold to the individuals who help you reach the top. At number 10 is Robert Newton. Robert Newton was the man who defined the pirate voice for all of history, a performer of immense charisma who became a global sensation in Disney's Treasure Island. To the public, he was a lovable, larger-than-life figure, a rogue with a twinkle in his eye. However, behind the screen, Newton was a man who practiced a relentless, cold-blooded betrayal of his own talent in every professional contract he ever signed. He lived a double life, where his charming pirate persona was a mask for a chronic, destructive addiction that he prioritized over the survival of his career and his family. The betrayal was most evident in his relationship with the studios and his fellow actors. Producers would go to extreme lengths to protect him, hiring menders to keep him sober and spending thousands to ensure he made it to the set. Newton would look these people in the eye, promise his sobriety, and then systematically betray that trust by smuggling alcohol on his sets in calculated ways. He was not just a man struggling with a habit. He was a man who clinically manipulated the kindness of those who were trying to keep his career alive, showing a chilling disregard for the hundreds of crew members whose jobs depended on his stability. Newton's ultimate betrayal, however, was directed at his family and his own health. He was given countless final chances by Hollywood and his loved ones, only to cast them aside for a life of secret excess. He chose his addictions over the stability of his home, eventually dying at the age of 50, just as he was about to face a massive legal and financial collapse. He proved that even the most lovable star can be cold-blooded when it comes to their own self-destruction. He left behind a legacy of brilliant performances, but for those who had tried to save him, his life was a frustrating history of broken promises and calculated deception. At number 11 is Sarah Miles. Sarah Miles was at the center of one of the 1970s most harrowing scandals when her manager was found dead in a hotel room during the filming of The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing. The investigation revealed that Miles had been engaging in a series of betrayals against her husband, screenwriter Robert Towne, that went far beyond typical infidelity. She had created a web of deception that eventually collapsed into a public tragedy, leaving her husband to face the world's judgment for her choices. The coldness of the betrayal lay in her reaction to the fallout. As the scandal threatened her career, Miles appeared to prioritize her own public standing over the emotional devastation of her family. She moved through the crisis with a clinical focus on her own survival, showing a shocking lack of remorse for the domestic chaos her secret life had caused. She betrayed the trust of those who had built their lives around her, proving that her own desire for excitement was her only true loyalty. The scandal effectively ended her status as a top-tier leading lady, but the real damage was to her personal legacy. She proved that a star can be worshipped for their beauty while being fundamentally cold to those who offer them stability. Her affair with fame and scandal was a definitive example of how betrayal can turn a Hollywood dream into a nightmare for everyone involved except the star themselves. At number 12 is Margaret Rutherford. Margaret Rutherford was known as the nation's auntie, a woman whose eccentric charm made her a symbol of British warmth. However, Rutherford carried a dark and violent family secret involving a history of mental instability and crime that she went to extreme lengths to bury. To protect her clean reputation, she essentially betrayed her own blood, distancing herself from family members in need to ensure that the public never saw the stain on her prestigious name. This clinical abandonment of her relatives was a choice of brand over blood. She lived a double life, presenting a facade of cozy respectability while privately enforcing a cold policy of silence regarding her family struggles. She betrayed the very people who needed her support the most, proving that her high-standing status in the acting world was more important than the emotional requirements of her kin. Rutherford died an Oscar winner and a beloved icon, but her private history is a study in the cold-blooded protection of an image. She proved that the most likable people on screen are often the ones who are most capable of a calculated, silent betrayal in their private lives. She chose to be a legend for the public rather than a savior for her family, leaving behind a history of abandoned relatives and a perfectly maintained but ultimately deceptive public mask. Betrayal is a clinical process. For these 12 stars, it was a necessary tool for survival in an industry that rewards the cold-blooded. They moved through life, leaving a trail of broken hearts and abandoned loyalties, proving that the most beautiful faces on the screen often hide the most ruthless hearts. We remember them for their art, but their families and friends remember them for the silence, and the secrets they left behind. In Hollywood, the greatest performance is not the one that wins an Oscar. It is the one that hides the betrayal until the very end.